Some stories don't get buried because they aren't important. They get buried because they are. Because if too many people knew the truth, certain myths wouldn't survive. And this is one of those stories. A story they don't want to celebrate the way they should. A story that should be etched into American memory. But somehow, it still lives in the shadows. Not because the men in it lack courage, but because this country has never known what to do with black greatness when it shows up in full view. So it took another nation to name it, to honor it, and to recognize it. Before they were legends, they were just black men in Harlem asking for something simple, a chance. In the early 1900s, Harlem was alive, a growing black community filled with ambition, leadership, artistry, and movement. But it was still America, which meant segregation wasn't just in the South. Equality was still conditional, and black people were still expected to wait their turn for basic dignity. But still, black leaders in Harlem pushed New York State for years to create an all-black National Guard unit. They weren't asking for special treatment. They were asking to be allowed to serve, to be seen. And finally, in 1913, New York approved it. Later, the world will come to know them as the Harlem Hellfighters, and this is their story. So first came the training and the racism. And right away, the hypocrisy showed itself. When these soldiers traveled south for training in South Carolina, the racism was so intense. It was so dangerous that they were quickly sent back to New York. Even in uniform, they weren't safe. Even while preparing to fight for America, they still weren't safe. America was still fighting them. And when the Army planned a grand send-off parade for the Rainbow Division through Manhattan, their commander asked for his men to participate. And the response was so cold. Black is not a color of the rainbow. A country was preparing to send these black men to die, but they wouldn't even allow them to march. But then came Europe and the culture that they carried. Once overseas, the U.S. Army still didn't treat them like equals. At first, they were pushed into labor jobs, digging, hauling, building railroads, essential work, but demoralizing. Because these men understood something clearly. Combat was where respect was earned. And America did not want black men earning respect with rifles in their hands. Eventually, the Army agreed to send them into battle, but with a condition. They would not fight alongside white American troops. They were handed off to the French Army instead. America would use them, but would not stand beside them. It was segregation, even in war. But let me tell you how important these men were. Because even before they became legends on the battlefield, they were making history in another way. One of the first black officers in this unit was James Reese Europe, a world-renowned musician. His job was to build a band. But that band did more than recruit soldiers. It carried the culture. Thousands of black volunteers stepped forward, many coming straight out of Harlem. And once they reached France, their music followed them. French audiences were captivated. Jazz began spreading across Europe. And as somebody from New Orleans, I always think about that. We see our artists touring overseas even now. Well, you could thank people like James Reese Europe. Because long before the world gave us flowers, black musicians were already shaping the soundtrack of the planet. We've been entertaining. We've been creating, even in wartime. So let's get back to the Hellfighters. Once this unit reached the front lines, history could no longer ignore them. Two soldiers, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, fought off a German raiding party so bravely that France awarded them the Croix de Guerre Award, which is a highly esteemed military decoration in France, and they were some of the first Americans in the entire war to receive it. They went on to fight in some of the bloodiest battles of World War I. During the war, the Harlem Hellfighters spent more time in continuous combat than any other American unit of its size, with 191 days in the frontline trenches. They also suffered more losses, more than any other American regiment, with more than 1,400 total casualties. They endured relentless frontline combat, they suffered heavy casualties, but they never broke. Their official name was the 369th Infantry, but the Germans gave them that name, Holland Kampfer, or however you say it, but basically it means the Hellfighters. The French called them Men of Bronze. They were feared by enemies and honored abroad, in a way America still struggled to do at home. But the bitter truth, they came home to parades in Harlem, but uniforms don't erase racism. The cheers faded, Jim Crow remained. They fought for democracy overseas and returned to segregation at home. They were celebrated in France, but second class in the United States. That is the hypocrisy. A nation preaching freedom while practicing exclusion. And maybe that's the deepest truth of all. Black people have been fighting battles for freedom in places that weren't even free for us, carrying wars we didn't start, defending democracies that didn't defend us back, still showing up and still becoming legendary, even when our own country couldn't admit where we were. Just look at this picture. Look at them. I see so much more than soldiers. I see culture. I see pride. I see dignity. Even in the early 1900s, these men were dapper. They carried themselves with a kind of integrity that didn't need permission. They made it look cool. They made it look powerful. They didn't just bring their bodies to Europe. They brought Harlem. They brought rhythm. They brought jazz. They brought style. They brought black excellence across an ocean. Black people have touched the entire world. We inspired fashion. We inspired music. We inspired the way people move, fight, create, and survive. And the deepest part, they were fighting battles that weren't even theirs, holding it down with honor, only to come back to a country that still treated them like second-class citizens. And that's why it's important to know your history, because we are the history. So remember to comment, like, share, repost, and follow for more stories that they won't put in your textbook. Peace.